Well, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodians of the lands on which we meet, and pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants, past, present, and emerging, and continue their cultural and spiritual connections to country, and recognize their global contributions to Australian and global society. With that, I'll introduce Angela Dean, our amazing Angela Dean, who needs no introduction, I think. Does amazing work at the intersection of conservation, social science, and economics.
Oh, so cool.
With that, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Matt, for the introduction. Thanks, CBCS. Now, I should also say I've got a terrible cough and a runny nose. It's allergies. It's not very glamorous, but it's not infectious. You're all safe. So today, I wasn't sure what to talk about. I got sort of changed my mind about projects, and talking to a few people, they went, just talk about everything. So I'm going to talk about everything. We're getting but the large focus is how can we make people do stuff for nature? So we've got a whole bunch of projects coming out about that, but today you're getting a tapas style plate. So I'm just going to do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and a little bit of that, and hopefully it will tell a cohesive story, but very happy to talk in more depth about anything at all, really, including soft core economics. So one of the things when we talk about making people do stuff for nature is the question of, well, what should we actually make people do? So the national strategies are a bit fluffy and go, just promote connection, empower people, but to do what? So when we think about behaviour, we often think about, we like to create gaps and fences between things. We're splitters, not lockers in sight. So we think about different types of behaviours. So there's stuff we can do in the home, which might be about planting certain things or wildlife-friendly practices in the garden. There'd be on-ground stewardship, so turning up for a land care restoration event or doing something like that. But there's also these civic behaviours. We know that systems change is really important for a whole bunch of stuff. We need stronger legislation. So should we get people lobbying, decision makers, protesting or voting or petitioning, all of that package of stuff. But we also want to share the norms to go, hey, everyone cares about this and everyone's doing something. So these social behaviours are a different packet again. So there's a lot of choices. So what should we make people do? So if we were going to prioritise, like I've got a program, we can't just, when we have a behaviour change program, we can't say, hey, do everything, because we know that's not effective. We need to be specific. The same with other sorts of conservation, we have to prioritise. So what should we prioritise? So we think about things like impact. Well, what's the most useful for biodiversity? That would be good. But we also want to say, here's a behaviour that people will actually do. So if I say the best thing for biodiversity is for you all to cover yourselves in mud and do something really gross, everyone will go, no, thanks, Ange. And it's not going to have much ecological impact, even if the behaviour was magic. No one will do it. So this is part of a project with the New South Wales Environmental Trust, which was a 3-year project that dragged into 6 with some changes to methods based on COVID and floods in New South Wales. So we basically had a process, this is just getting submitted maybe tonight, a list of 28 behaviours for biodiversity. So we had an expert elicitation study, which some of you would have done just before COVID perhaps, which is an annoying 40-minute online survey using best first choice methods. So we had 143 experts, and then we also surveyed over 3,000 community members to look at the likelihood. So how easy or hard would it be for you to do this thing? And we also asked, do you already do it? So obviously if 90% of people say they already do a thing, you're not going to get much bang for your buck by trying to pump that to 92%. So you want something that people aren't already doing. So this was our ratings of behaviour. You can see our highest impact behaviour up here was vote. But being in, this will make some people cross, happy to talk about it at drinks. Being a small orange circle, not a big blue one, means 70% of Australians think they already do that some of the time. So when we say, oh, vote for the environment, to us, that might mean do this, do that. But others, it means, yeah, I voted for a party and they've got an environment policy. So that's like, tick. So we've got to think about how our messages about action actually resonate in the audience. And if they think they already do it, even if we don't think it's actually doing it, that's going to make it harder to engage them. So generally speaking, we would want to focus on the stuff that's in this corner. The stuff that's down here is not very useful and a pain in the bum to do. the stuff up here is useful and less annoying to do. So the blue spots are the ones where at least 50% of the population say they don't do it already. So in a way, the restoration activities are the ones that fall into that category, which we know are really important. It's the decade of restoration. We know that social dimensions of restoration are really important. There's all this stuff going on. So that's really heartening. It makes sense that the hardest behaviours were about purchasing land. We know that most people just can't go and purchase a few acres with a land conservancy or something like that. But the other things that are potentially things like pets and quarantine laws feel easy for people. These easy things, though, you can see that most people say they already do it a bit. So a lot of the talk from now on will focus on more of those land restoration types of things. So how do we make people do stuff is the shorthand for my life, and often the spoiler is it's hard to make people do stuff. But we've had, as part of this New South Wales grant, we had a couple of studies about enabling action. And this was meant to be one ginormous experiment where we allocated people to nature experiences or citizen science experiences or messages, but because of COVID and floods, we split them up. So we did a bunch of message experiments looking at communicating what types of things, but we also did a thing where we got disengaged people into nature and said, hey, here's your nature experience. How motivated are you to do this stuff? So the message experiments. Oh, wouldn't we all go out and do something for this little fella? Social scientists don't get to put animals in their slides very often, so it's quite exciting. So some of the messages were wildlife focused, and we had messages about threats or solutions or integrated messages. Hey, this is bad. Hey, there's stuff you can do. And then we also had messages about places. So these are 2 separate experiments, each with 4 conditions. Not going into the detail because it's messy. And then we had one about places. Places are threatened. Hey, there's stuff you can do. What do you reckon's going on? Who votes for what message? Yell out.
I think I'm wildlife.
Top.
Wildlife.
Critter. See, look at us. This is a great example of what works for us. It's not always what works for everyone else. So the wildlife message actually worsened compared to the control condition and the other active conditions. This little message about this guy being threatened actually reduced intentions to engage in restoration. Oh, sad face on him. But the place-based message actually strengthened intentions. And, oh, sorry, what's going on? What the Fascigal? I said so we've got no idea is the shorthand answer. So we're still doing a lot of analysis. So this message is doing something about how people engage with the message, how people respond to it, and maybe something like relevance. Maybe places are less abstract for people than a pretty animal somewhere. There's also some stuff with efficacy, so people feeling capable and knowing what to do. So even though this message wasn't efficacy focused, meaning it wasn't there to say this is how you do the thing, there still seemed to be some efficacy going on with here. And what I wonder, the next study, is having these images of, so Tracy's PhD was all about images, and stuff about people are more engaging than images without people. So I'm wondering if the fact that there's picnic tables here and a pathway and human stuff somehow meant this message did something more to make people think they could do something. So I need to put this guy on a picnic table and see what happens. So watch this space. There's going to be more analysis. We've got a lot more data about the mechanisms, but it's just a little too untidy to share with the world just yet. So this was one about building engagement in nature and creating nature experiences. And what we hear a lot, especially in a place like CBCS, because we all love a picnic possum and we all love nature, is to go, oh, we just need to get people loving it. Oh, and just get them out there, get them loving it, and then it'll all be okay. And that's a lovely sentiment, but there's not a lot of data to say whether that's actually going to go on. So what we did is we got 20 people who indicated that nature wasn't very important to them. We got them through a social research company, so we have a bunch of questions, do you like sport, do you like your family, whatever. So we picked ones, nature is one of those, and we picked a bunch of people who said nature was sort of low in the mix. We got them on a guided nature experience, so we first of all took them to a spot. This is one-on-one interviews. We sort of said, right, what do you reckon about the spot? Then we being John Turnbull from Marine Explorer, who did the actual interviews because it was during COVID in Sydney, and he knows stuff and is amazing. So took them on a guided walk on either a terrestrial area, a coastal area, or an integrated blue and green space, and said, hey, here's the stuff, here's the critters, here's the natural history of the place. And then we did an interview about stewardship. going, what do you reckon? So what we found is that everyone loved nature. Everyone went, wow, this is beautiful. Oh, it's just like being a kid. My family would like this. Oh, we should come here more often. They're all loving. There's no not loving of nature. But everyone went, someone should look after this. It's you. So this thing about responsibility being totally externalized. It was nothing to do with them. Someone else should look after this. Someone else is naughty, littering, and someone else should do the looking after. And it was very much, well, it's the government role. This is for people. This is for society. Surely there should be a person dedicated to the cause. Or that you need to know about stuff. Like you need to be an expert and go, well, I don't know anything. So yeah, there was one quote, you should do this, you know the things. And then when we probed people on actual specific actions and actually getting them off the board, they really focus on these really basic following the law types of things, like don't litter, like minimising your impact according to sort of legal ordinances, but not this sort of step up to do something bigger and better that we know is really important. The stewardship is not just not littering, it's not just putting your rubbish in the bin, it's actually going above and beyond all of that. So for me, what this sort of says is the nature loving is not really the rate limiting step for getting people active in nature. What the real issue is this thing about externalised responsibility. So I've done a lot of work, Tracy did too, with water management, urban water management, oh, Brian as well. Anyway, now I feel like Bridget Jones. They're with water management. So when you talk to Australians, especially people who've lived through a drought, they really understand and agree with statements to say, yes, Australians can do stuff about water. Households can make a really big difference to domestic water use, and we all have a certain responsibility to do our thing. And people might not be doing the right thing all the time, but they're very easily gotten into that space. And what I've realised, I think, thinking about this and a few of the other projects related to this, is that didn't happen by itself for water. It's not innate. People don't innately know what to do. It took decades of water management organisations priming and engaging and working on community engagement stuff to say, hey, we can all make a difference. So for biodiversity, how can we apply some of those insights to go, how can we really activate people to make them feel responsible and able to contribute? So the next bit of tapas is, tapases haven't come out. They must be all animated or something. Anyway, is not important, is about psychological capital. So one of the things, so I have a background in mental health, which means I like to sort of sneak it into a bunch of other stuff. But one of the things we do is to go, when we want someone to get out of bed and do a thing, there's a whole bunch of things about life, about your perceptions, your emotions, how you feel, whether things are crap or not for you, that makes it easier or harder for you to do the things for conservation. So psychological capital is piece of jargon, but really talks about a suite of characteristics. It's things like hope, optimism, well-being, sometimes efficacy, resilience. But these characteristics are really about enabling people to pursue goals. They're really important for that. Able to see a situation positively. So when I used to play soccer, my coach would say, and you can only see the legs. You've got to learn to see the gaps between the legs. And life is also like that. And I could do that in life, but not on a soccer pitch. But also be resilient to setbacks. So things are difficult, but how do we keep going? So these psychological capital things, I'm going to talk through a few studies that relate to this. Oh, there's the tapas. So the first one is, this is also part of the New South Wales Environmental Trust study, where we really wanted to understand where people were at in terms of engaging. These are committed stewardship volunteers. So when you talk to organisations, and you were, Jonathan, with your New South Wales peeps, and like getting volunteers and keeping them is really challenging and an issue. Like if you talk to on-ground groups, they go, oh, the people, and someone under 50, please. So come on, you guys, most of you are under 50. Anyway, so what we were going to do with this project was going to be something else. And then talking to a bunch of groups, they really went, everyone feels a bit frazzled. And we went, okay, we really want to dig into this psychological capital in this sort of group. So what we did is we explored burnout and risk of attrition or dropping out. So burnout is a sort of medical concept. It's more complex than the way we've assessed it in this particular study, but it really has multiple dimensions. So it's feeling emotionally exhausted and all used up. It's feeling like you're not useful anymore, and it's feeling like you need to disengage. So a lot of the burnout literature initially came into medical staff, so doctors and nurses or people in sort of challenging situations, but it's now applied in a whole range of settings. And I guess there's recognition that even though volunteering is not the same as a day job, that you can still have burnout in these other types of scenarios. So what we found is that we surveyed 1,000, just under 1,000 committed stewardship volunteers across Australia. Some were for large organisations like Landcare, Bush Heritage, Greening Australia, but there were also smaller groups as well, like local community, bush care groups, catchment groups, that type of thing. So what we found is that about 1 in 10 are at risk of burnout or risk of quitting. So 10% say they're thinking about dropping out. 10% suggest they're at risk of burnout. We don't say they are burnt out because we didn't do the full medical diagnostic thing, but it means they scored in their responses to questions in a way that suggests their levels of emotional exhaustion are potentially high. So that was about 14%. And 10% said that their symptoms are worsened by volunteering. So most people, like some people are burnt out, but then you go and plant a few trees and look at a bird and go, oh, that's better. But some people, off they go to volunteer and they feel more frustrated, more burnt out, feeling like it's a strain and more used up and more emotionally drained. So that's really risky. How do we make those people, enable them to keep going? So that's 10% of people score in that side of the graph. So when we do some modelling, looking at what attributes contribute to burnout or risk of quitting, the main sort of spectrum of stuff is sort of not surprising. The people at risk of quitting are people who say they're less likely to have an enjoyable experience when they're out there. They have more negative experiences. That's sometimes social, dealing with conflict within the group. Sometimes it's looking at vandalism or just, bureaucracies being annoying. Sometimes it's observing environmental degradation and going, oh, this is depressing, and expecting the future environmental change in their patch to be negative rather than positive. So that sort of all makes sense, but we wanted to know, well, who is actually experiencing these things more? And what we found is that people in coordination roles, leadership roles, are much more likely to experience those negative things and much more likely to then be at risk of burnout. And this is like, these people are these are super important, these people. We don't want to lose them for all sorts of reasons. And yet that can be a risk. We also found that people with higher well-being were more protected from those things. So we also looked at hope and optimism. There's some slightly weird patterns of stuff going on in there as well. But overall, things like well-being meant people were more likely to be able to see a positive future, to have more enjoyable experiences. And there's some obviously complex stuff there about whether someone with well-being makes a different choice, so does something more enjoyable, or steps into the same experience but just sees the gaps between the legs more than the other person. So again, this is just preliminary analysis, but we're trying to dig in to go, what's really going on and what's modifiable within this system, because saying, hey, get well-being to people is not so straightforward. But can we make these people actively more support? Oh, no. Okay, so I guess how do we better support those in coordination roles? So again, this is easy to say, but not always easy to do, is make people feel appreciated. So we know, like when Deanna has Coral Watch volunteers, you make them appreciated because they're giving you their time. But who's giving the support and appreciation to the leader or the coordinator? Like that's really, really hard. So what systems do we have to support them? We also recognise that there are, often we focus on particular tasks, like do you know about these particular seeds if you're in a seed collecting program, or do you, what technical skills do you need to do the restoration? But these other skills, these social interactions, some people are really good at creating social cohesion in a group. They might not know about seeds, but maybe they do other things. So can we create skills, either support those people who are good at that in the group, or provide those sort of skills, recognising we don't want to go, oh, hi, here's another skill to an already burnt out person we're suggesting you get. But how can we embed some of those mechanisms into volunteer groups? I guess the other thing is sometimes volunteers are spending their time in an area where federal funding or large institutional funding is declining, and there's this perception that like the government's just saying, see you later, and can you sort it all out, volunteers? And that's obviously the limited equity of that is depressing and discouraging. So if we can make sure that volunteers see themselves as part of a well-funded system, again, easier said than done, but to go where there are good, well-funded parts of the system, making sure people are aware of that and feel connected to it is at least. And also succession planning. So this thing about going, often coordinators stay perhaps through into periods of burnout because they feel there's no one there to step up for them. So are there other ways? And we've all got some probably experiences with small community groups. There's interesting dynamics. There's often a champion where a lot of things are dependent on that person, but sometimes it's hard for that person to share or allocate tasks effectively to other groups. So there's this stuff there about how can we make that sharing happen more effectively. So this is the paper that got accepted this morning after 4 rounds of review and almost 2 years. So it's in cost letters, or it will be about who. So this was funded by the Queensland government, and it's about water quality practices. So we know climate change is the biggest threat to the reef, but water quality is something under the remit of the state government, and we know water runoff, pollution runoff from agriculture, cane farms, for example, is a really important contributor to poor inshore resilience. So water quality is still something we want to fix, even though climate change is still up the top. So this particular project was part of their broader investment in understanding social dimensions. And so it's about policy instruments. So there's regs, there's grants, there's financial instruments, all of these other things for soft and hardcore economists. There's what we call suasive instruments, which are like policy instruments about investing in extension programs, or behaviour change programs, for example, information sharing, and also these governance types of instruments like collaborative planning. So governments invest in these policy instruments, but being able to figure out how effective those are really challenging because there's a policy mix. There's about 1 million things layered on top of each other. So empirically disentangling that is really difficult. So this project was looking at the effectiveness of these instruments, as well as the influence of both the characteristics of the practice, whether it was hard or easy, as well as the characteristics of the farming population, whether that influenced what they were doing. So, what I'll focus on today is that. So this was a massive, I just like sticking this photo into every talk I do. This was a massive collaborative study with about 1 million different disciplines. Again, Helen Mayfield was our head wrangler, but also Kate Helmstead, who's ex-CBCS as well. And one of those examples where you go into a room with people and go, and they say a word, which is sort of a normal word, but you go, what do you mean by that? And being able to navigate all the different language across disciplines is really important. So that's just the point, is that there's a big project. Bayesian networks. So this is a Bayesian network expert elicitation model. So basically what we do is we set up a network. Who's a Bayesian? I'm not a Bayesian network expert. Have we got anyone in the room? We've got someone shaking their head, which means they are, but they're shy. So basically we've got a thing, so we've got an instrument, an extension approach, we've got a mechanism, whether someone's engaging with extension, we've got characteristics of the people, whether they agree with the issue, and the practice, whether it's difficult or not. So we put time together building this large conceptual model about policy instruments and adoption. And that's the model. It was, if anyone's parameterized a model, you would know that this is quite tricky. So we developed a conceptual model. So this was, again, the research team would put it together, and then we'd go to the government stakeholders and they'd give us advice, and we'd reshuffle the model. Then we'd go to industry partners, people like industry groups, and they'd go, oh, but what about, and then we shuffle, and then we come back, and then we'd loop around again. But basically every blue box is a characteristic of a policy. So here we've got do it. There's extension. So extension, for those who are not sure, it's another piece of jargon, is basically education for farmers. So education and skills training programs about new practices. That's where the financial instruments and the grants are. So things like credits or an adoption grant up there. Here we've got behavioural insights, behaviour change, governance instruments and regulations over here. And then the outcome, adoption in 5 years. And we've got our 2 key pathways to adoption, motivation and capacity, recognising we need both. So we parameterise that. This took hundreds and hundreds of hours. Like this was a lot of work. And Helen wrangling different disciplines and people is a total pain in the bum, and she did it incredibly well. But just some insights for today. So this was some of the findings about the impact of instruments. So this, we've got best practice extension, upfront financial. This is non-regulated practices, by the way, all instruments combined. And you can see we've got a bit of a spread. So the blue end is if we set all of those practice characteristics, it's easy, it makes sense. All the farmer characteristics, they care about the environment, they've got good skills and education. If we set them all to positive, we get adoption up at this blue end, but if they're all set to negative, our adoption is at the yellow end, which is pretty poor and still in the sort of 5%. So this really tells us that this variation, understanding what drives that and being able to potentially modify or act within that system, is a really important way to go. I should breathe. So this is just one example of the data. So what we did, so this left-hand thing is that all characteristics set to their most negative, which is adoption is 4.8% or something like this. And this bar over here is everything set to their most positive, which is about 58%. And then what we did is we flicked things on and off one at a time. So for example, if everything's positive, but we flick the lever on whether a farmer has sufficient financial resources and say they don't, then boom, you lose a lot of adoption just from that one thing. The other thing that was the second most important thing in the population characteristics model was what we've called mental bandwidth, which is people's capacity to think about new stuff. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then when we look at some clusters of things, again, this financial, if everything's good, but you flick off financial capacity and other things related to that, you lose most of your benefits of your instruments. And again, this is human capital. So this includes the mental bandwidth, but also education, access to skills and stuff like that. But the thing is also, if everything's bad, just flicking a few positive things often isn't enough to get you over the line. So this is a really challenging situation. So in terms of the riff for today about psychological resources, this, I guess we were a bit surprised that this came out as strongly as it did. And it's really, really resonated with all of the industry partners. They just go, oh, thank goodness. So, and if you think, like, so who's a PhD student in the room? So say that that's a few of us, and the rest of us have probably been one at some point. So basically, if you imagine that week before your PhD is due, maybe 2 weeks, for some of you that was quite less, and to go like, you're just going, oh, you've lost your brain, breaking your cups, you're just like, you're nuts. And then if I rock up and go, oh, I've got this new form, the grad school's got a new form, and you just need to fill that in. It's 10 pages. It's on a website you can't really find. No one will answer the phone. Oh, that's true. No, this is not reality. This is like even more annoying. So you're all just going to go, Ange, go away. Like, no, thank you. Like, bugger off entirely. You do not have the brain space to think. So this sort of model, so I really got into this. So there's a guy called Shah who's published in Science with this concept of mental bandwidth, and he's more of a cognitive scientist, cognitive psych, dealing with quite controlled scenarios of making people live with scarcity and then getting them to do cognitive tasks. So putting them in a poverty situation experimentally, and it changes their decision making. They make poorer decisions. And really saying that when you live with stresses, you have a cognitive load. And that cognitive load makes it harder, takes away your brain space for dealing with other stuff. So their metaphor is like it's traveling with a small suitcase. Like if you've got a big suitcase for holiday, you just go, yeah, chuck in every pair of shoes, that's fine. Whereas with a small suitcase, you've got to make trade-offs. You go, oh, one pair of shoes, which one? Oh. It's exhausting. So if we're dealing with people, whether they're urban communities, whether they're farmers, whether they're people in a particular ecosystem that we're focused on, if they've got bad backs, dealing with divorce, drought, the house is flooded, and we're going to go, hey, I've got this new conservation thing you can do. They're just going to go, oh, so over it, no thanks. So understanding the context in which people are living that we work with is really important. And sometimes that might be, I think the challenge for conservation is to go, what's our role in actually improving those other things? Yes, we'd like to fix climate change and stop the droughts and flooding. That's a bit hard, it's a bit of a long game. You know, is it our role to provide broader education or to, you know, so we normally focus on this quite specific thing and we've just gone, oh, social science, we can do behaviour stuff now. And going, should we also be doing, so community conservation obviously embraces this approach where some conservation programs put in health services and things like that to sort of embed wellbeing in the community. Some of them with PhDs about that. But that's a broader question that there's no answer for, but understanding and making our recommendations realistic is important. So the last final riff, do I have left time for one final riff? Yeah, I just answered that question, Kate, sorry. Is we wanted to talk about hope and optimism in enabling engagement in reef conservation. So hope and optimism are other forms of psychological capital. So we know that conservation can be a bit depressing, you know, reefs bleaching, that critter's dying, and it's like, oh, and then I've got this form in the grad school, and like, oh, it's all too much. So there's movements like conservation optimism, but there's also ocean optimism, earth optimism, have really sprung up to try and say, they're not saying, hey, it's all fine, but I guess they're trying to go, let's have a narrative where we can talk about some solutions and some successes to stop us all just standing up at the pub every Tuesday. So, but the question is, and this has inspired quite a few debate. I've had some colleagues here going, oh, optimism, it's terrible. And I go, but is it? And there's not really a lot of data. So this question is, does hope and optimism inspire action? Or does it make us go, great, feet up, have a relax? So there's some, and again, there's people in the literature that say both. So this was published recently, earlier this year in Conservation Biology. And one of the reviewers went, I don't know if this is relevant for conservation. And I went, here's 28 commentaries in your journal about this topic. And I went, yeah, okay. Here's a new discussion that accompanied that. So basically we had done this original study, which was a survey of more than 4,000 Australians going, hey, we asked someone like you to do something for the Great Barrier Reef, what would you do? And about a third of people said they didn't know. A lot of people said plastic, going, oh, recycle a bit. And only 4% mentioned a climate action, like I can reduce my electricity use or advocate against Dali or whatever. And about 3% said, stop climate change, but not a specific thing that they could necessarily do. So what we did is we used this data set. We had also collected some data about hope and optimism. So I should also say this was dispositional optimism, people's general tendency to be optimistic or to be hopeful, not necessarily optimistic or hopeful about the reef per se. So it's about them, not the target. So what we found is that I won't go into it in detail, but happy to chat if needed, is that there's these subcategories of hope. And one part of the hope definition is about understanding ways to act. So hopeful people feel they have a goal, they know what to do, and they feel they can do the doings. So people who scored high on that type of hope were more likely to be able to identify climate actions. They also said that they were more willing to engage in those climate actions, and they were also more able, sorry, got no words left, are more likely to identify plastic actions compared to no actions. So they could identify more types of actions, and they were more likely to do the climate actions. When we looked at some of the mechanisms for this, a lot of people actually go, oh, hopeful people, they just think the problem's not as bad. What we found is that hope, the pathway between this and ability to identify climate actions was actually greater appreciation of threat severity. So hopeful people went, yes, the reef's in more trouble, and yes, I am more affected by the trouble for the reef. So the hope is not some just, oh yeah, dodge the bad stuff type of emotional or dispositional state. It's actually, and it's not undermined. I guess there's some of the concerns in the literature that hope would undermine these things, but it's not. It's possibly, if anything, strengthening them. So I really like this quote in one of the 27 commentaries in the conservation journals, that hope is a verb with its sleeve rolled up. Hope helps you do stuff. And I think rather than undermining action, it can, and importantly, and we don't have the data to talk about today, but that hope or these positive states can actually coexist with concern, with a bit of despair at times, or these other negative emotions or negative states. We are not either or sorts of people. We can have a bucket of complexity in how we're approaching an issue. And maybe that bucket, having both bits of the bucket is important. So in summary, change is tricky, but it's worth trying. Thinking about the psychological capacity of our audience and where they're at, what they're able to do, what they're ready to do. So we've got our aspiration at the end of the tunnel, but there might be quite a few dots between where people are at and how we get them there. And I think that thing about how do we take everyone with us on the journey, especially those who are struggling, and that might be in all sorts of ways, people struggling with environmental change, rental crisis, whatever it is. But things aren't easy, and if we are kind and make people think of people as humans, fellow humans, rather than just people to do stuff, that will help us. Just to riff for some other projects that are on the go, in case anyone's interested. So we've got a couple of projects about monitoring stewardship, so large social monitoring programs. We've got one with the Brumper looking at Great Barrier Reef and healthy land and water with South East Queensland. If people want to piggyback on data collection and stuff for a project, always happy to chat. We've got some stuff about appreciation of Moreton Bay, what people do and don't get about what's under the water. And what we're starting to do a bit more often, and we've got a few projects about this, including one Emily's working on, is really that recognising, rather than just thinking about the individual and how to make them do a thing, is to go, there's these groups in conservation, and wrangling groups of people is a whole extra special kettle of fish. So how do we better allow groups to work together and collaborate both within the group and between groups to support conservation outcomes? So we've got a bunch of stuff, including the postdoc that will be announced in a month or two as well. So, and that's me. Oh, thank you. These are all the New South Wales Environmental Trust people, and thank you to them, especially for letting me drag out a 3-year project to 6 years. And this is the Queensland government team. Thank you. Happy for any question at all. Yes,
I'm
Martin.
doing it because I feel like I should have picked it up. I was really interested in that last section. So are you saying that it's, because I've often sort of reflected on the difference between hope that is like an intellectually based hope that things will actually get better versus just the emotion that even though we can think things are not going to get better, we actually don't feel incredibly dragged down and depressed by that. Is that sort of keeping those things apart? Yeah, so again, psych loves to split everything up into different things. So there's the different types of hope. So there's that dispositional hope, which is about, and the hope people say that they're very different to the optimism people. So optimism, dispositional optimism is just thinking something will be okay, but it's not focused on how it will end up being okay. Whereas hope is more, dispositional hope is focused on feeling like you can do a thing. But then there's these other things that are discussed, and now I've got a total blank on the adjective. There's in Ola's work, do you know? It's there's a sort of a, what's the word? Crappy hope, I'll call it. It's not crappy, it's like a superficial hope. Is going, oh, it'll be fine, so I don't need to do something. So that's one of the other subtypes of hope. And then people sort of talk about the hope related to certain topics like hope for a reef. But there is that sort of, I guess, aligned what I think you're saying is, or asking about, is that just maybe that choice. Like there's a, sorry, I've got no words at all. Ended a deadline and I've lost my vocabulary. There's sort of it's not palliative hope, but that's sort of just hope, radical hope that when you go, well, things are pretty crap, but I'll make a choice to move forward because what else can you do? Has anyone seen the Chasing Coral movie? And there's that bit at the end that I really like with Charlie Veron talking to that young dude. And he goes, well, you've got to do something because how will you live with yourself if you don't? And and I think there's a broader radical hope. And I guess in the humanities, there's all these books and commentators that use jargon I don't understand talking about radical hope. So there's a bunch of theory about that, but it doesn't sort of intrude into the behavioural end of things. Brian.
Yeah, look, I think a great talk. I must get back into a lot of this. So in the second half of your talk, that kind of dialectic between, I suppose, thinking that the world is pretty shitty, but we need to do something and we can.
Yeah,
That's a really important thing that all of us face all the time. And I've been talking to a lot of management consultants and facilitator type people who basically run their whole sessions around this.
right.
I mean, you start with simple things like SWOT analysis, where on the one hand there's threats and risks, but there's also opportunities. And I think that ties in not just with individual psychology, but with your emphasis at the end on groups.
Yeah.
Because I think group talk about what we can do and why it's worthwhile and how it can be effective and how we can work with other partners is a really important form of social action.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it there. I think
let's have
there's
a coffee
always
and
that
read
kind of
about
risk
it.
and opportunity thing that's in play.
And I think one of the challenges for ecology and conservation is obviously evolving and shifting, but for those of you who are ecologists, like the focus when the bubble that you're in is on an endangered or almost extinct animal or ecosystem, like that's your thing. And so, I come along as a social scientist and go, how about a positive narrative for your audience? And you're going like, no, so I need to think about where ecologists are at as well. That's a tricky place for you. And I guess the thing is, some people say, how do I do all that? And going, you don't have to do everything. So in other bits of science, we collaborate. If I want a geneticist, I talk to Liz, or she'll tell me who to talk to if she's not the person. So if you need someone to give a chirpy narrative to motivate people, but you are depressed and not able to do that, you don't have to. Collaborate with someone who can, and teams of people can share those skills. Kate.
I have a question from Dave Polton in the chat.
Yeah.
Great talk, Angela. On the matter of externalising responsibility, do you think that the increasing professionalisation of the environmental movement may lead people to scale back their own personal voluntary actions?
Yeah, I don't have data on that, so I totally agree that it's possible. And there's a bunch of critiques out there in the broader environmental movement, like in the 80s after the Franklin and Brian will be able to comment more on this. So jump in if you've got an answer. But there were people becoming professional politicians and working in funded movements rather than activist or grassroots movements. And for some degree, people would argue that took the pressure off those grassroots movements. But I think those grassroots movements are always evolving and adapting. For me, I see a lot of that grassroots energy focused on climate rather than like restoration sort of stuff, because that's where a lot of the zeitgeist is. So, but yes, I agree it could be, but I don't have data on that. If someone else is, feel free to jump in. This one.
Amazing presentation, really interesting. Thank you. I just have a quick question about, do you have any information on data on use of emotion for conservation purposes? How the things like what PETA does is like make you feel bad, so you donate, whether.
Yeah, I think we use it in some of our studies, and our messaging study with the little critter in the places, we've got measures of emotions. And what, again, messy, my personal bias, as well as the data in that study supports it, is like there's a lot of this argument about, should we focus on positive, should we focus on negative? I'm going, actually, I think you need both. And again, it's not a binary bucket to go, if you're watching a movie that's transformative or motivating, you go, it's sad, I did that. You can have both throughout the moment of engagement. And I suspect the emotional requirements for action are multifactorial, and that this whole positive or negative thing is the first thing, I think. But the data's a bit mixed. Some negative emotions are important. I think that's where the data probably sits, but I think that doesn't mean you can't have some positive ones in the mix.
You sort of answered the question, but this is coming from maybe an American political perspective where fear is everything, right? Like the fear of loss of your guns, the fear of loss of your right to control your own body.
Yeah.
And those are the things that drive people to the polls.
We need to put
nothing,
rights to their
nothing else,
nothing
nothing else seems to work. Okay, maybe Obama had a moment with hope, but like the rest of it is just fear. It's just fear all the time, and it works amazingly well. I'm curious why fear for fear works for certain things, with respect to maybe our bodies or certain rights we feel are inalienable.
Yeah,
But it doesn't work with things that maybe we just care a little less about, like the environment.
yes.
Is there some
Some sort of loss aversion, so some of the site that comes into that is about loss aversion and that people are generally more loss averse. So if you say you're gonna lose this, your rights to bear pygmy possums versus gain this, you know, people are much more loss avoidant. And the Tersfian, I can't say his name, and Canada got the Nobel Prize there a bunch of times ago, and Thinking Fast and Slow, those guys, if anyone's read that book. So the most of the research where that loss aversion stuff has come out of health, where there is immediate relevance to yourself. This is you losing a thing. And a lot of the transition of some of those health theories into conservation have been really complicated because their conceptualization of how likely something is to happen or that vulnerability, like how much it affects you, has not always, I think, been measured or captured with as much nuance as should, because I can say the pygmy possums are all going to die, that's a loss, but to what degree that relates to who I am is the other thing weird with the pygmy possum message though is we found some of the messages did more poorly in more nature connected people. So there's some weird crap going on with those messages. But so yeah, the fear stuff, it's more about stuff that relates immediately to you. And as soon as something is external to you, it all becomes more complicated in terms of the emotions that loop that in, and possibly conditional on whether you care about the thing. But yeah, complicated. True.
Yeah, thank you for the amazing talk. I'm very interested in your first slide. So you mentioned we identify the behaviors
Yeah.
that could be with big impact and also people like to do but not already do.
Yeah.
So we found maybe volunteers could be an important audience to focus on the restoration on public lands. So my question is, have you ever collected data about the people who already own the lands, the private lands, and what kind of regeneration work they'll do and what kind of impact they can have?
You mean the landowners rather than a volunteer with the
Yeah, not
program?
volunteers to do some restoration near
Yeah.
your house, public land, but how about private land? Because in Australia.
Yeah, there's some projects on restoration and social and ecological outcomes coming up in the next NESP round. So there are some stuff about to happen. If you're going to submit and look for a postdoc, that could be something. Yeah, so there's some projects going on that are just getting started in that space, but in terms of the landowners, and I guess it's that thing about also with emotions and experience, when you see something positive on your land, to go, do you go, yay, I've solved it, gin and tonics all round, or do you go, yay, I can do it and do more and more and more? So understanding those feedback loops. And what you see with some people, again, we're having a chat with a colleague, Vanessa Adams, who's at CBCS, about things like, you know, when you've got citizen science or wild tracker or monitoring data and you don't see the animal, but you do see a cat or something like that on camera traps. And, you know, what motivates people, sometimes a negative feedback can give some people this sense of moral urgency and go, damn it, I'm going to get that bloody quoll on my property and I'm going to do this restoration. Whereas other people, it's just, oh, that's crap and I want to stop now. So understanding those experiential feedbacks and how they shape motivation to keep going, I think is not really well studied. So we're hoping to plot some of that into some of those projects. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
It's just interesting that you mentioned so much that people's well-being has such an influence on their ability to take action or for farmers to adopt certain things. Given, you know, into the future that we are taking on so much more of a cognitive load, sort of in my opinion, that might be shared, but how do you see that going? Do you think that there will be more of an investment in people trying to reduce that, either from a government perspective or a community perspective?
So the question is, how will we go in a low wellbeing future? Is that the question?
In terms of conservation action.
Yeah, it's challenging, and I think something like wellbeing is also quite context dependent. Like when you assess a social advantage or disadvantage, there's not this set indicator, but it's relative to the community in which you're living in. So I wonder if like there's some basic elements of well-being, like are you safe when you go to sleep? Is there food on the table? And then there's these broader mental bandwidth sort of capacity to just think about other stuff. I guess that would be, a lot of the social researchers would say one of the really important dynamics to think of those is all those social ingredients we know make for a stronger society, which is stronger social networks, grassroots connecting of people within communities, all that building of social capital might be a way to not just, so Emma Church is not here today, she's remote, but you know, who works on social capital and conservation engagement, and all of those supportive networks are really important to help you act for nature, but they're also important for everything. You know, if we have an apocalypse or just a flood or whatever it is, those social networks are really helpful. And one of her studies, which was also funded by the New South Wales Trust, but I didn't talk about it today, was about social capital in these urban waterway management projects. So people were brought together for stewardship. And then as part of the evaluation, given that COVID happened in the loop, people going, yeah, the networks I made doing that river stuff was so useful for COVID. My neighbours brought me food. I didn't know them beforehand, before the stewardship program. So there's this big rolling of arrows where those sort of things are really important. Kate.
Kath, lovely. I feel like developers use the fatigue factor to their advantage to do research inform on ways to counter this.
That's a bigger, I think I need a glass of wine to answer that question, Kath. But I think, and also climate deniers and like Trumpian politics totally use fatigue to their advantage. Like there's like techniques, it's called fire hosing, according to some people, where people will just spray a bunch of crap, like random wrong facts and misinformation. And all the earnest conservation people are like, I'll just fix that fact, oh, that one. And then we're all exhausted to do anything. And that's a deliberate strategy. So in terms of developers, I guess it's that thing of going, hi, can you write the 27th impact statement? Maybe we should, I was going to make a mean comment. I won't. So I think maybe that thing about supporting each other, having networks of people. So rather than a bunch of individuals all getting exhausted, negotiating sort of planning approvals or responding to them in the case of developers, to be able to support and share those skills. And obviously civic engagement to improve the processes, but that's a slightly aspirational answer for that one. Yeah, Matt.
Excellent talk. I have a question about sort of getting back to the politics side of things. Do you get a sense, especially with the the animal versus the landscapes message, do you get a sense that when you do a lot of these surveys methodology, what's going on in some people's head is they're trying to interpret like, oh, is this sort of like a hidden political message? Whereas so like if I look at everyone like kind of thinks, oh, pretty nature views, that's not really political. Yes, yay nature. But oh, endangered, threatened thingy, I bet there's some sort of political thing going on here. So now you've threatened my conservative political identity.
Yeah, that's definitely how people respond to messages. So we know that when you look at a message, and this is something we don't actually, we study some bits of that, but not others. So we've got data on people's political orientation, and that's one of the things we're going to look at to see whether that moderates the effectiveness of the messages. But and we know that when you see a message and go, is that sort of aligned with my values or my gang or my in-groups, I'll go, yeah, and adopt that message if it looks like it's from someone else or from greenies and I'm not one, then people will disregard the message. And we've even had data that even messages about citizen science, I think some people go, citizen science, it's a great Trojan horse for conservation because it's just science, not conservation. But even those messages get political splitting on how people engage with those messages. So that could definitely be one of the things. One of the things I was chatting with a colleague the other day about is also where people think the messages come from. So for a lot of these sort of studies, we just go, here's a message, read it, but we don't actually say it's from a person or an organisation or where. So some studies do, and if you make it, but that could be one source of variation, that people are making assumptions about the source of the message and then responding based on that assumption. So thinking if we do another circle of these, including something either about specifying a source or asking people where they think the source is as a control variable, I think, yeah. Yes,
More in the chat.
yeah.
G Tang, hi Angela, thank you for the comprehensive presentation. 2 questions. First, could you share your opinions about the differences between hope and efficacy, self-efficacy and collective efficacy? And I think this concept may be abstract for some. So the second question is how to measure hope in your study.
Okay, so the question about hope and collective efficacy. So again, these concepts are sort of similar, but sort of different depending on, so again, like when I'm teaching these sort of concepts or working with like conservationists, generally I sort of say, you don't need to worry about the differences. It's just, if you want to publish in a psych journal, you need to get them really nailed down. But the sort of differences would be generally efficacy. There's 2 types of efficacy. One is feeling able to do a thing. So I feel able to drink this water. And there's response efficacy, which is I feel that drinking this water will make me feel better or hydrate me in some way. So those are the 2 types of efficacy. So collective efficacy might be if we all drink this afternoon at Lucy's, then we'll all like, so it's those sort of concepts. But efficacy is generally related to a specific action. I can do it or it will be useful, or we can do it and it will be useful. So the way hope was conceptualized in this more, so the definitions of hope and optimism that we used actually come out of mental health. So they're used in a lot of literature related to depression and self-harm and stuff like that. So the definition, the way that they get measured, they're measured quite differently to that though, but they came out of working with those sort of social groups, is really not about any specific action. So it's about me. I'm a person who can do things. I can always find a way around a problem. When I have a goal, I can find a way to get there. So they're much more abstract and detached from a specific action. Whereas when we talk about efficacy, it's usually action specific. That's probably the main difference. Happy to chat further if they need.
So maybe let's sort of end it there. I know that there might be some more questions, so but let sort of people get some lunch, and I'm sure Angela's always
Always,
available
except
to
2 in the
chat-
morning. Yeah.
Chat.
Yeah. Thanks, gang.